Howdy, I'm live. Thanks for learning about MS with me, Aaron Boster. It's Sunday morning, almost 8 o'clock in the morning, and I couldn't help myself. I wanted to jump online and say hello, howdy, hi to this amazing online community and answer your questions and talk about a few things that was on my mind. I'm trying to configure the chat here, guys. Bear with me. There we go. Hello from Arizona. For all of you that are jumping online, good morning. Do me a kind favor and include your name. I've got your name there. Include where you're calling in from. I love seeing this growing online community. It warms my heart. And so I've got Martha here from Dubai. Hello, Martha. I had a chance to visit Dubai last year, one of the most amazing cities I've ever visited, absolutely colossal. I've got Mohammed here from Arizona. Hello. Revi is here. How are you doing? I recently, yesterday, published a video, and I've had mixed thoughts about publishing videos on weekends, but it seems very well received, which is kind of exciting to me. It's a video I put out on what causes MS. And so I'm going to throw a link in the chat. So I've got a link down there. If you haven't checked out that video, click it and tell me what you think. I've got Hey from Texas. How are you? I've got Vicky here from Tolan. It's great to see you, Vicky. And I thought I would use this opportunity, guys, to share with you a little bit about what we think causes MS, and then I'd spend a few minutes talking about how we diagnose MS. And so if that sounds okay to you, thank you for joining me, and we'll make sure to allow some time for questions as well. Mike from the UK is there. I've got Lena from Norway on the line. This is really awesome. Got friends from Russia who have called in. Wow. So when we're talking about the cause of MS, the easiest answer, the quickest answer is we actually don't know. It's not solidified exactly what causes MS. I am going to share with you, however, what I refer to as the party line. So our best understanding in 2019 of what leads to develop MS. It is not gospel. I think 10 years from now, we'll look back on this live stream video and we'll say, haha, remember when Aaron thought this? But I want to share with you at least our understanding. And so it starts off with what we call a genetic predisposition. Certain groups of people share gene patterns. So if you hail from the Fertile Crescent, if you hail from the Northern Europe, if you hail from a certain part of the world, very likely people in that area share genes with you. You share patterns of genes. And it turns out that certain genes that encode for the immune response, oftentimes seen in folks that trace their ancestry to Western or Northern Europe, tend to have an increased risk of having autoimmunity. Now, hear me out. That doesn't mean that if you're from Morocco, you can't get MS. It simply means that in a population, there are more Norwegians who are developing MS than there are Moroccans. And so the first thing is a genetic predisposition. Now, clearly, a genetic predisposition isn't enough. Otherwise, everyone that hailed from a certain area of the world would all have an autoimmune disease, which is obviously not the case. And so in the background of an autoimmune predisposition, a genetic predisposition, we then think that there are environmental risk factors. And one of the best studied environmental risk factors is exposure to vitamin D. So we humans mostly get vitamin D through the sun. Some things have vitamin D, some foods have vitamin D in them, like oftentimes we add vitamin D to milk, for example, but you can't get enough that way. So we really soak up vitamin D through the sun. And in areas of the world close to the equator where there's lots of sun, we'll see high levels of vitamin D. And in areas far away from the equator where there isn't a lot of sun, we see low levels of vitamin D. And we believe that low levels of vitamin D pre-puberty probably increase an individual's risk to develop MS compared to not. And so again, that's not gospel, but the data is pretty solid. And when I review it, I certainly believe it. Now, there are other environmental risk factors. For example, exposure to tobacco smoke. So exposure to smoke in utero, secondhand smoke, smoking tobacco increases an individual's risk beyond their genetic predisposition to develop an autoimmune condition. Now, please don't leave this chat saying, Dr. Boster said, if you're a pasty white kid from Ohio whose parents hailed from somewhere in Northern Europe and smoke cigarettes, you're going to get MS, because that's not true. I'm simply sharing our current understanding. And really, to make sense of it, you have to think of it at a population level. So we have a genetic predisposition, and then we have environmental factors that can raise that. There are other environmental factors that have been studied, like high salt diet, morbid obesity, other things, but they're less well clear. Now, it's those environmental factors in the genetic predisposition, again, is not enough to cause MS. We then think that there's a problem with the immune response, where the immune system sees a foreign invader. Oftentimes, we think about a virus like EBV, mono, the kissing flu, and we get the virus, and our body builds an arsenal, an immune arsenal against the virus. And in doing so, we, by accident, that arsenal also identifies part of our own body as being that foreign invader. And once we set up that autoimmunity, we can't really undo it. And every time those cells circulate and they see that part of our body, they think it's seeing a virus and they attack it. And in the setting of MS, we're talking about an autoimmune response impacting the brain and spinal cord. So that was a really fast, dirty version of the video that I just put out. If you guys haven't seen that, I'm going to post it again down in the comments. Check it out, click on it and see what you think. Leave me a comment and tell me your thoughts. And so before I jump into the way that we diagnose MS, let me turn to the chat and we can answer some questions. But of course, first I have to have a little bit of my morning grog. So to listening one says, hi, I left my cat live stream, Suri Noel, for your live stream when I got the notification. Hit the bell, people. Oh, wow. To listening one, thank you very much. You're a riot. This nice person oftentimes will identify moments in my video where I'm loud or whether I screech or something, and they'll leave a timestamp. So if you look at their comments and you click them, it's always really fun. I super enjoy your comments. Thank you very much, and thank you for jumping on the live stream today. Amber Raver is there. Good morning, madam. As many of you know, Amber is my MA. She's amazing. I couldn't get through a clinic without her. And she is a key member of this MS team as we work together to make you the most awesome version of you despite having MS. Good morning, Amber. Good morning, Keely. I hope you're both doing really well. And I hope that you've watched the movie Hustle and Flow like we talked about on Friday. I've got people from Iowa or Idaho here. Hello, Jennifer. Kathy Piper is here from Michigan. It's wonderful to see all these folks. So I've got someone from Wales. And Kate from Wales writes in, is there generally a trigger to start MS if you're predisposed, like pregnancy, virus, trauma, etc., that starts an MS cascade? We don't really know, but in the hypothesis that I just shared with you, we believe that in the setting of a genetic predisposition and then potentially environmental risk factors that raise that predisposition, we then think there might be a viral trigger. You might see a virus, your immune system makes an arsenal against the virus, and it turns the wrong way. The immune system's response, unfortunately, also identifies parts of you as a foreign invader. And so we do think that there might be a viral trigger. But again, these are works in progress, and it's not solidified. It's not gospel just yet. So I've got Candy Duncan on the line. Candy, it's great to see you. Martin writes in, the video on MS causes is another great video of yours. Thank you very much, Martin. That was really a question that someone asked me, so I was responding to the question, and I'm really glad that others have benefited from the response. I've got a good afternoon from Dublin, Ireland, one of my most favorite cities in the world. It's great to see you. I love your pubs and your live music there. Wow. Hey writes in, can you do a video on urinary tract infections, Jennifer? I do have a couple videos on my channel about bladder. I have a video that I recorded from a urology friend of mine on UTIs. Unfortunately, my videography wasn't very good, so it's kind of hard to watch. So yes, I will take your recommendation and I'll add that to my list of videos in the upcoming future on UTIs. Lynn Butters writes in, I had chickenpox twice and glandular fever before 15. I believe these are a trigger for me. It's unknown. Unfortunately, right now, we lack the technology to identify with an N of 1 and 0 degrees of freedom in an individual human what actually triggered MS. We don't know that yet. I hope that one day we will be that savvy and we'll be able to figure it out. You know, I always hallucinate that awesome show Star Trek. And I mean the original Star Trek. And I think about Bones. So he was this grouchy medical doctor, and he had a tricorder, and he would flip open the tricorder and go, "They've got MS, Jim." And he was able to figure everything out. He was able to diagnose everything with his tricorder. And I really wish I had a tricorder. That would make life way easier. Looking at some other questions. I'm just reading through all these questions, trying to find one. Lynn writes that she loves Star Trek too. Well, we're all in good company here. I'm a nerd as well. So Aaron writes in, I get so fatigued without warning. I'm afraid I won't be able to finish grad school. Is there a medication that I can take for the profound fatigue that comes on? So Aaron, you are not alone. I've spent almost a decade and a half trying to help families with MS. I sat in rooms with folks with MS for a very long time and talking to them. And I can say with authority that the number one symptom in multiple sclerosis is fatigue. And it's a fatigue that is very, very hard to explain to others. When I'm trying to get a spouse to understand what I mean when I talk about MS pathologic fatigue, I oftentimes use the following example. Imagine that you went to work on Monday and you worked all day Monday and you came home and had dinner with your family and then you didn't go to bed. And then Tuesday morning, you didn't sleep, you took a shower, you went back to work on Tuesday, you worked all day Tuesday, and you came home and didn't sleep. And then Wednesday morning, you and I go on a 10-mile walk. That's about as close as I've been able to garner in talking to people with MS to get people to understand the profound nature of the fatigue. And it can be life-altering. It can cause loss of work. In fact, it's one of the two reasons why people are most likely to leave the workforce. So this person's writing in, hey, what can I do to help? And I'm worried I can't get through grad school. Now, grad school involves a lot of thinking. And oftentimes we're set in front of a computer or we're set in front of a book for 8-10 hours trying to learn some information or write a paper. And if you have pathologic fatigue, gosh, that's really hard. So yes, there's a lot of things that we can do to try to ameliorate that. And I have an entire playlist on my YouTube channel on fatigue. So if you haven't seen that, I would encourage you to check that out. If I remember in the post, I'll throw a card up above and then I'll include links down in the description below. But in brief, there's a couple things that we can do. Before I talk about medicines, you have to think very carefully about behavioral things. Because if there are some behavioral changes that we can make that improve your fatigue, you would like that. One of them is sleep. Most people don't sleep enough hours. And so if you're getting 5-6 hours of sleep, you're robbing yourself. And you may actually need to budget for more sleep, literally the number of hours of sleep. If your sleep is interrupted by spasms and cramps, if your sleep is interrupted by waking up to go to the bathroom multiple times, if your sleep is interrupted by neuropathic pain, if you have obstructive sleep apnea and you wake yourself up snoring, or if you have restless leg syndrome, these can erode the quality of your sleep. So even though you did the hard work of getting in bed and trying to sleep, you didn't get restful sleep. You want to address that because improving disordered sleep and improving issues related to sleep hygiene can make a profound difference in your energy levels. Now, I'm not selling snake oil. I'm not telling you to get a good night's sleep and you'll have no trouble. I'm simply pointing out that we have to approach this from all angles. Another almost paradoxical recommendation, but it's a solid recommendation, is to stick in a little exercise. You might say, Aaron, are you joking? I just finished telling you I'm so tired. I'm having trouble getting through grad school. How am I supposed to exercise? I hear you. My point here is that if you can integrate a little bit of exercise, it actually helps you consolidate sleep at night and it gives you more energy. And so it's hard at first, but if you can slowly work into a pattern of exercising a little bit each day or every other day, you will find that you actually have more energy. Now, when you're thinking about energy, we have to think broadly. And we have to think about other things that can impact energy, like depression. If someone has undertreated depression, very commonly, they can have a concomitant fatigue. And so I point out here that if you have depression and it's undertreated, treating your depression can actually improve your fatigue. We also have to think about which medicines you're currently taking. Certain bladder pills, certain spasticity pills, certain antidepressants, certain neuropathic pain medicines can all contribute to fatigue. And so you have to think critically, are these medicines that I'm taking, could they be contributing? We also have to think about drugs and alcohol. Alcohol is a sedative hypnotic, and many drugs, recreational drugs, are depressants. And so we have to think critically about whether or not we're contributing in that regard. Now, once you get through all that, and I want to highlight the fact that that's a lot of stuff. There are medicines that can help us trick our brains into being more awake. And there's evidence within MS that they can help improve the quality of your life by improving fatigue. Now, these medicines are things in the stimulant class, things like Adderall, Vyvanse, Ritalin, and they're amphetamines. And they improve attention in MS. And that's one of the biggest problems in MS is your ability to lock on to a task. If you can't lock on and attend to a task, you can't remember it, and it can impact your thinking and memory. And also, these medicines can trick you into being more awake. Now, they're not magic, and a lot of times I explain to patients it's like drinking a pot of coffee, but in some people, they can make the difference between getting through grad school and not. And so I would certainly, along with all the other things I mentioned, consider a trial of one of those medicines. There are other medicines like Provigil and Nuvigil. Now, mind you, all these medicines are off-label, and you're going to have to talk to your doctor about the risks of the medicines and whether or not they're safe for you and whether or not it makes sense to try them. But thank you for asking the question. I hope that helped. So let's see what else is there. So Ivy writes in, "Hi, I'm 43, and I was just diagnosed with MS, and I'm still struggling with the everyday aspects of life, like diet. Would you please give some advice?" Like, howdy. You were recently diagnosed with MS, and it's my experience in diagnosing folks with MS and going on a journey with them that it typically takes people about 1 to 2 years to become comfortable in their own skin with their diagnosis. Your MS will literally be different than if you had a twin with MS, which means you can't compare your experience with someone else's experience 1-to-1. It doesn't work that way. And that's frustrating. But it also means that as you try to understand your disease, you may talk to a colleague and say, "Hey, I just got diagnosed with MS." And they may say, oh, when I was in camp, I had a friend from another state, and they had a dog, and the dog had a best friend that was a squirrel, and the squirrel got MS and exploded. And that has nothing to do with you. And so it is a journey. And I'll share with you that almost without exception, people come into a degree of comfort understanding their own MS, excuse me, as it relates to them, and it takes about a year or two. Now, in that time, what do? I think that you have to hold on to a couple core things. You're still you. You didn't change who you are. You have the same goals that you used to have. You have the same likes and dislikes, and you want to live your life as fully as you ever have, despite having this condition. What do you need to learn about? You need to learn about how to take an MS medicine, how to make sure it's working, seeing your neurologist to have physical examinations and to talk through what's going on with your MS, to have serial MRIs to make sure that you're not having new spots on your drug. You need to commit to a lifestyle that includes exercise as part of your lifestyle. Clean eating is helpful, and you mentioned diet. I have a video on my YouTube channel on what I think is the best diet for MS. If I give you like the quick skinny, I recommend eating real food, stuff that's not made of chemicals and simple processed sugars. That's largely my own opinion, but you're online with me, so I can give you my opinion. We need to supplement low levels of vitamin D, and we need to avoid tobacco smoke. If you can do those 4 things early on in your disease course, as you start to decode and understand what MS means for you, I think that you're going to move into this condition and start this journey in a really strong way. Now, I have a couple videos specifically for folks that are newly diagnosed to my channel. I have a playlist called Start Here, MS Basics. And so if you haven't checked that out, I would encourage you to check it out. So what else do we have going on? So Michelle Murphy writes in. Michael Murphy writes in. Sorry, Michael, I couldn't see. My eyes are getting old. So Michael Murphy writes in. Question, does a spinal tap really tell you if you have MS? So a spinal tap or a lumbar puncture is where we take a really small needle and we stick it in your back into the sac the spinal cord sits in. And there's a bunch of fluid there called cerebrospinal fluid. So that's the fluid that bathes the brain and the spinal cord. And that fluid can be taken out and sent to a laboratory for study. Now, when we do that, we also have to take blood because we're doing a comparison between the spinal fluid and the blood. In essence, what we're doing is we're looking to see, are there a bunch of immune response, an overly active immune response in the spinal fluid compared to what we see in the baseline in the blood? And if we see an overly active immune response in the spinal fluid, that means it's an overly active immune response in the central compartment, brain and spinal cord. That doesn't mean you have MS, but if it's positive, it gives a suggestion towards MS. And in fact, the newest diagnostic criteria incorporate spinal fluid as part of the, to lead to a diagnosis. So to speak more clearly, you don't need a spinal tap to diagnose MS. The vast majority of people that we diagnose at Ohio Health, where I work, do not have a spinal tap. When there is confusion, when the history isn't classic, when the demographics aren't classic, when the MRI leaves question, then I think a spinal tap has great value. But it's not a requirement to make the diagnosis. There are times where a spinal tap can be a tiebreaker and can provide a diagnosis when we're kind of on the fence. And I think that's where it's helpful. Great question. Thank you for asking it. Now, I guess I'll say one other thing about spinal tap and about blood. So there is a laboratory test called neurofilament light chain. Neurofilament light chain. And if you guys haven't heard about neurofilament light chain, you're going to hear a lot more about it. It's a result of axonal breakdown. So the axons, which are the individual nerves in the nervous system, when they get cracked and they spill their guts, one of the things they spill into the milieu is this neurofilament light chain. And you can check levels of neurofilament light chain in the spinal fluid and in the serum. We can't do it prime time. You can't just order it and send it to a commercial laboratory. This is still done in research. But it looks like neurofilament light chain levels in the spinal fluid and in the serum are predictive to help diagnose MS and to predict worsening MS and to predict attacks, which is really amazing. And so when we talk about diagnostics and we talk about biomarkers, both in the CSF and in the serum, I think that neurofilament light chain is going to be very helpful. My dog River just stopped over here. River, sit. River, sit. Good girl. Come here, I want to show everyone you. This is my beautiful dog, River. Hi, baby girl. You're so pretty. So River came over to say hi to you guys. It's a good baby dog. And she's absolutely fantastic. I sometimes hallucinate about what it would feel like if I got to take River to work. I think I would probably be like the happiest kid in the universe if I could take my dog into my clinic with me. That's a dream. It would just be phenomenal. Wouldn't it, baby girl? All right, guys, sorry about that. I had to say hi to my dog. So there's a couple questions here about CSF. Let's take another look. Does your skull have a name? So you guys are commenting on my skull over there. So when I was in medical school at University of Cincinnati and we were learning neuroanatomy, they literally gave each student a human skull. It was unbelievable. This is a real life human being skull. And we were allowed to take it home for a semester. Now, if I grab this skull, and this is a plastic model, but you can see it has all these holes in it, like these tiny little areas. And those are where nerves go in and nerves come out. And we had to memorize every single nook and cranny in the skull. And so when you look inside here, where the brain sits, every ridge, every bone, we had to understand. And so I spent tens of hours holding a human skull in my hand and memorizing every nook and cranny, every suture, every hole. It was part of my education. And I was so touched that I was holding a human head, that this person who had passed away made it possible for me to learn. And I wanted to get a human skull. I know that's a little morbid, but I wanted to have one as a reference. And so I was given that as a gift. It's not a actual human skull, it's a model. Why do I include it in my videos? Honestly, when I make YouTube videos, I want to keep you guys engaged. And as some of you know, prior to starting YouTube, I had no experience with videography, none whatsoever. And so I watched a lot of YouTube videos on how to make YouTube videos. As you might imagine, I've gone through a lot of mistakes and errors and fumbles. One of the things I read about was including props. And so when I read, oh, a prop, I thought, I have a skull. So since then, I've included my skull in a lot of my videos, and it's just something I've started to do. But thank you for asking about it. My skull does not have a name. Some people are saying hi to River. She is pretty. She's absolutely fantastic. All right, so Martha writes, Dr. B, is it true that the disease is normally stable for the first 5 years in diagnosis, and then it becomes more aggressive? I'm currently on Mavenclad, and I feel good. So no, that's not true. I would not say that the disease is quiet for 5 years and then gets active. I would say that the trajectory of the disease is different for every person. And I would say that during the first 5 years of the disease is when there's the most neuroinflammation, the most activity in the brain. Now, that doesn't mean that the person manifests disease activity, clinical stuff. I'm talking about behind the scenes, which is why it's so darn important to get serial MRIs, particularly early in the disease process, because you might feel good, not because there isn't new inflammation, but because your brain is young, your brain is plastic, and it's rewiring itself. And so if you get an MRI and you see new spots, new active inflammation, it allows you to intervene. I'm glad to hear that you're on Mavenclad. Mavenclad is a pill that is approved in Europe. It's approved in Canada. The actual name is cladribine. And it's not yet approved in the United States, but it probably, I think, will be over the next year. So people are saying that my dog is a beauty. And someone commented on my pajama pants. I didn't think about that. I'm wearing pajama pants. I guess that makes a lot more sense than wearing a robe when I'm online. Now, one of the things that I thought I would do today, in addition to talking about my new video, and again, I'm going to post a link so that you guys can click on my new video if you're inclined, but I also wanted to talk to you about how you diagnose MS. Now, I've made a video on how to diagnose MS, and I'm probably going to put it out later this week or maybe next week, but I thought I would run through it with you guys on the live stream. So there are a set of diagnostic criteria that allow us to diagnose MS. And they're pretty solid. There's no blood test. That's too easy. You can't draw some blood and say, aha, MS. We don't have that. But the criteria were initially proposed in the 1960s. They've been revised in the 80s. We got into what we call the McDonald criteria in 2001. And our most recent rendition, our most recent update was actually in 2017. The diagnostic criteria are really solid. And there are 5 elements. And I like to joke that's perfect because I have 5 fingers. So as long as I go through all my fingers, I never forget anyone. So let's talk through each element of the diagnostic criteria using friendly patient language to help you understand how do we diagnose MS. So let's jump in. The first thing that we look at is your history. Now, that's really your story. We call it the medical history or the history of present illness because that sounds cool. But we're just listening to your history. And what we're really listening for is either episodes of discrete attacks or a slow progressive decline in function. And we're listening for elements of the history that remind us of MS attacks or MS progression. Now, the second element is your neurological examination. And what we're doing on the neuro exam is we're trying to buttress what you told us in the history. So for example, if you said, Doc, I lost vision in my eye and then it came back partway, I would expect to see evidence of subtle damage of the eye, either when I look in the back of the eye or when I shine a light in the eye or when I have you do special visual testing, etc. I'm looking for evidence on exam to support what I saw or what I heard in your history. So that's the second element. The third element is the MRI. And in the modern era, we lean heavily on the MRI for diagnosis. And there are certain features on the MRI, the brain and spinal cord, which are very classic for MS. And so we're looking for white spots in certain locations. And we're looking for certain patterns which statistically highly predict multiple sclerosis. So I would say that the third element, the MRI, is one of the most powerful biomarkers. Now, in keeping with the question that I was asked just a couple minutes ago, number 4 is a spinal tap. And if you have positive spinal fluid, meaning you have unpaired oligoclonal bands or an elevation of the IgG index, then this is also contributory towards MS. Now, I have a couple videos on spinal fluid. And so if you have questions about spinal fluid, I would encourage you to check those videos out. I'll throw a card up above in the post, and I'll include links down below about spinal fluid. The fifth element in the diagnostic criteria is, hey, by the way, Aaron, prove it's nothing else. And that's actually like a giant task. We want to make sure that there isn't a structural spinal cord problem or brain problem that's causing symptoms mimicking MS. We want to make sure that there aren't infections or metabolic conditions or other neurological conditions that could mimic MS. And so to go through it really quickly, the history, the examination, the MRI, spinal tap if you get one, and then prove it's nothing else. Those are the 5 elements that we use to diagnose multiple sclerosis. And so I hope that was helpful. What do you guys think? Send me some comments and let me know. Is it a helpful way of kind of thinking about the diagnosis or not? So 2 listening 1 writes in, is there a difference between what you're calling an attack and what you call progression? Yes, there is. Again, I'll throw cards up above where I describe what is an MS relapse, and I'll throw a card up above to describe what is progression. And the way that I want you to think about it, they are 2 different things. A relapse, the pathologic underpinnings, is when you have autoreactive cells in the bloodstream that cross the blood-brain barrier, gain access to the central compartment with brain and spinal cord, and attack it. And they cause an area of new acute inflammation. And they basically short circuit a part of your brain or spinal cord. So an easy example would be like an optic nerve, and then you can't see out of your eye. And there's a classic presentation of graying out of your vision over a period of several days associated with pain with extraocular movements that lasts for weeks and then slowly gets better. That's an attack. Progression is a loss of neurological function separate, independent from attack. And there's a lot of theories about what causes progression. And again, I want you to check out my video on what is MS progression, where I spend 15 some minutes kind of breaking that down in some great detail. So listening 1, check that out and let me know what you think. So Pam writes in, proving it's not a MS is hard, especially when Lyme diagnosis gives false negatives. You know, and Lyme is one infection which can cause some things that are similar to MS. And we can prove that you don't have Lyme by checking some special blood tests or spinal fluid tests to demonstrate that Lyme is not a culprit. There are areas of the United States where we see a lot of Lyme. There are other areas where we don't see a lot of Lyme. There's a lot of misunderstanding about Lyme. And there's even some predatory clinicians out there that have Lyme clinics where they'll tell you have chronic Lyme and they'll have you do these very unusual things. And I need you to take caution if you find yourself in a Lyme clinic. That's always a fear of mine, that you're going to be trapped and be mistreated. So Kate writes in, can you meet the McDonald criteria without lesions on the MRI? And in 2019, no, I don't think so. To have a brain MRI that has no lesions, 0 lesions, makes it really hard to diagnose MS. That's very, very unusual. And so if I had someone that had neurological symptoms concerning for MS and they didn't have any brain lesions, that would raise a red flag. I would look to see if they had optic nerve lesions and spinal cord lesions, and maybe they had a cousin of MS, NMO spectrum disorder, or anti-MOG, or something like that. But if there were 0 brain lesions, that would be unusual. In that person, I would probably get serial MRIs every 6 months for many years to look and see if new brain lesions did in fact evolve or develop. So Sarah Wood writes in, what is the likelihood of my children having an autoimmune disease when I have MS and there's other autoimmunity in the family? And she gives examples of rheumatoid arthritis, fibromyalgia, lupus. So these numbers about prevalence and incidence of MS are challenging. And in fact, here in the United States, the National MS Society recently updated the incidence rates of MS. We used to talk about 400,000 people, and we've been saying there's 400,000 people with MS for like 2 decades, for a long time. The most recent update said there's like 930,000 people, excuse me, so almost 1 million people in the United States with MS. So I want to start off by saying that the overlying incidence of MS is a moving target, and we're learning that it's a lot higher than we originally thought. But if you have MS, there's a slight increased risk that your family members will have MS. And so if we used to think about the prevalence in Ohio as being about 1 in 500 or 1 in 700, if you have MS, the risk to your first-degree relatives is more like 1 in 100 or upwards of 3 in 100. And so it's higher. Now, it's not super, super high like some genetic conditions, but it is still higher than the general population. Also, if you have any autoimmune disease, it's very likely that someone else in your family will have autoimmunity. And so I see this all the time. Now, it doesn't have to be the same condition, as you point out. You can have MS and your auntie can have rheumatoid arthritis and your cousin can have lupus. This is very, very common. Why? Probably because you're sharing a lot of the same genes. And you may share some environmental risk factors as well, maybe not. There are probably some things that we can do to decrease children's risk of MS. This is not proven gospel, but I want to share with you some of the data nonetheless. Exposure to secondhand smoke or smoking markedly increases an individual's risk for MS. So if I had MS, I would want to make sure that my children were not exposed to secondhand tobacco smoke or that they didn't smoke themselves, because that would be the single best way to increase their risk. There's some evidence that low levels of vitamin D in children pre-puberty can increase the risk. And so one might talk to their pediatrician about checking their children's vitamin D level and supplementing their vitamin D to push it up. There is some data that suggests that morbid obesity in children, so being markedly overweight, can increase the risk to develop MS almost by a factor of 2. It's a really, really high risk. And there's some discussion about high salt diet increasing the risk for MS. Now, all this isn't gospel, but my point is, if you have MS, obviously you don't want your children to have MS. And so there are some steps that you can take: avoiding tobacco smoke, staying physically active, avoiding morbid obesity, supplementing low levels of vitamin D, that all might be able to alter that risk further. Excellent question. Thank you for asking it. So Cameron Sexton writes in, happy birthday. Mine was yesterday. Cameron, happy birthday to you. We have very close birthdays, so let's sing. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Cameron. Happy birthday to you, and many more. So Martin writes in, I recommend supplementing vitamin D at least 2,000. So Martin, this isn't really an environment where we give recommendations like that. We certainly have recommendations for our patients, and I will say that we want people to take D3. D3 is more easily absorbed by the body. I'll also say that the very best way to track vitamin D is to check a blood level. So if you check a blood level, it'll tell you where you are, and then we can give recommendations on the exact amount of vitamin D then. But I don't want to give a blanket recommendation for everyone. I don't think that would be fair to everyone listening in. So MoMA of 7 Hustler, that's a cool name, writes in, can you explain choking in MS? Yeah, so there's a circuitry that runs swallowing. And it's really controlled by some structures in the base of the brain stem, and there's some nerves that come off the brain stem that control the soft palate and the muscles of the throat to help you swallow. And if you have damage to the upper cervical spinal cord or to the base of the brain, people can develop difficulties with swallowing. And this is a very, very concerning thing, because if you don't swallow properly, you might put food down the front tube instead of the back tube. That front tube is your airway, and you can have what's called aspiration pneumonia. And so I have a very, very low threshold to explore concerns about swallowing. If you or someone you love is sputtering at the dinner table, coughing and choking when they eat or when they drink fluids, you need to bring that to the attention of your provider. And there's some tests that we can do to sort that out. I'm actually very lucky. As many of you know, I get to work in a comprehensive MS center where we have a large interdisciplinary team, including speech pathologists. And these amazing men and women can come into the clinic room and they can literally do a modified barium swallow test in the room, where they can look at how you swallow and they can help you determine the safety. Oftentimes, if there's trouble swallowing, we can correct it with behavioral techniques. Things like a chin tuck, where you put your head down and forcibly swallow, or drinking through a straw, or thickening liquids, or learning to literally pay more attention when chewing and swallowing. There's a lot of things that one can do, but it's very, very important, and we have to take it seriously, because aspiration pneumonia can lead to horrible things. And so thank you for bringing that up. But the take home here is, if you're having difficulties with swallowing, whether that be with liquids or solids, you need to bring it to the attention of your provider. Very important. So Sarah writes, I choke on my own spit. All the more reason to talk to your provider, Sarah. So that's your homework for Monday, is to call your MS provider and say, hey, I'm having some difficulty with swallowing. I need to be seen. So Rosemary writes in, I have MS and now diagnosed with Hashimoto's. Is it likely if you have one autoimmune disease, you'll get another? So yes, statistically, if you have one autoimmune disease, you're more likely to have a second autoimmune disease. That is statistically more likely than if you didn't have any to begin with. My mentor, Omar Khan, used to say, sometimes nature is a little too generous. Shelby writes in, what are specific recommendations for symptoms you could expect to see if you had lesions at C2 to C7 level? So she's talking about spinal cord. So the way that I interpret that question is, what does the spinal cord do? So all the information from the brain goes down the spinal cord into the arms and legs and body, and all the sensory information goes back up the spinal cord to the brain. So if you have damage in the spinal cord, you're going to interrupt those pathways. So if you need to scratch your face, your brain tells your spinal cord, tells your arm to scratch, and the motor movements of your hand start, the signal originates in the brain and it goes through the spinal cord. If you have damage to your spinal cord, that message might not get there, and it may manifest as weakness of your hand or clumsiness or difficulty with movement. So spinal cord damage can cause difficulties with strength. And if it's a cervical spinal cord lesion, it can affect the arms or the legs or both. You also have sensory information. So if someone is touching your hand, that information will go back up your spinal cord to your brain and say, hey, my hand is being touched. And if you've had damage to the spinal cord, the information that's being touched goes to the nerve, and when it gets to the spinal cord, it dies. And so the information doesn't get to your brain normally. So light touch might not feel like anything, or it might feel an abnormal sensation like pain or cold or pressure or something weird. Also, if you have spinal cord damage, it can affect the down theres, the bowel bladder, and sexual function. So those are some classic findings that you can see in the setting of spinal cord. So Christy Cooper says, how can you prepare leaving the country for a possible attack while you are away? So Christy, this happens to many of my patients who get opportunity to travel abroad. So, oh my goodness gracious, what if I'm in fill in the blank country and then I have an attack? What do I do? Well, I think the first question is, how long are you going to be gone? Because if you are going to be gone less than a week, we can wait until you return. We don't have to treat an attack within the first couple of days. As long as we can get to treat an attack in the first couple of weeks, there's a high likelihood that we can be affected with our medicines. So the first thing is, if you're going to be gone for 3 days, or if you're going to be gone for a week, that's not a long enough time frame where I'm super concerned. Now, let's say you're going to be gone a month. A month is too long to wait, in my opinion. Then we have to ask, well, where are you going? And so if you're going to a remote jungle, that's very different than if you're going to, say, a developed first world country. If you're going to be in Munich, Germany for a month, that's very different than being like in the Congo. Munich, Germany has some of the best MS doctors in the universe, and they have awesome healthcare. And so your options for seeking treatment, if you had to, are a little different than if you're in the jungle of the Congo. Now, one of the things that I've done on occasion with some patients is I will send them on a distant trip with a bottle of pills. I'll give them a bottle of prednisone, and with very specific instructions to call me if they were to have symptoms of an attack. I would have them go to a local urgent care where they can get a urinalysis to make sure they don't have a urinary tract infection, and then we could go ahead and green light them to take the oral prednisone. Now, do not interpret what I just said to say, Boster said I should walk around with a bottle of prednisone and I can take it when I'm having an attack. That is not what I'm saying. I'm telling you that there have been circumstances where patients that I have profound trust, many of them are actually doctors, will go on a trip for a long period of time, and they're out of the country, they're gone for months, and I will send them with a bottle of prednisone with very explicit instructions. that if they develop symptoms consistent with an attack, they can call me and then we can talk through it. I can send them to get a urinalysis wherever they are to make sure they don't have a urinary tract infection, and then we can give them instructions to be treated abroad. But what I would prefer that most people take away from this comment is that if you're not gone that long, you can wait until you come back to be treated. Okay, we've been going on for about 45 minutes, guys. I'm going to wrap this up. I'm going to take one more question. I have had a great time with you on this Sunday morning. I know that I have not done a great job of announcing ahead of time that I'm going to do a live stream, and I have to come up with a better way to do that. And so if you guys have ideas about when is the best time to live stream, please include those in the comments here. I would love to hear from you when you think it's the best time. Why have I been doing these impromptu live streams in the morning on the weekends? It's because I wake up and I'm busy doing work and my family's upstairs sleeping. And I think, what the heck, I want to jump online. I miss you guys and I want to interact with you. And so I empathize that I need to do a better job planning so that I can give you a heads up. And I'm still struggling to figure out exactly the best way to do that. And so again, I ask you guys, if there's a time that you think is best or a day that you think is best, let me know. I'm still trying to figure that out and figure out the right cadence. So it's a bittersweet test. What about intermittent painful spasms in the hands and feet? They don't last long and my hands lock. So what I'm hearing were the hands and feet cramp. Cramps are part of spasticity, very common in MS. Spasticity affects about 70% of people with MS. And it's always worse during the winter months when it's cold outside. It's also worse when we've been still. So when you're sleeping or you've been driving or sitting at work, and it can be terribly painful. So the first line of defense is to stretch. Now, I'm not selling snake oil that if you stretch, you'll never have a problem, but stretching out your hands and stretching out your limbs can make a really, really big difference. There are medicines that can help with spasticity. And I have several videos on spasticity on my channel. So again, if I remember, I'll throw a link up above and down in the description below so you can check those out. Staying warm, wearing hunter's mittens that have electricity that runs through them to keep your hands warm and to keep your feet warm with hunter socks can combat the cold-induced spasticity. And staying moving, staying limber can also help. And so thank you for that question. So I'm going to wrap up now. Thank you so much, everyone. There's 80 people that have jumped online on this Sunday morning. I'm so appreciative, and I really love this growing online community. It means a lot to me. As we enter into the work week next week, I wish you the very, very best, and I hope that you and yours are safe and healthy and happy. My name is Boster, and thank you for learning about MS with me. And until my next video or live stream, take care.